And you're live, Neil.
All right. So good afternoon, everybody. And we're back here again in the compound, as I call it, up in Highland, New York. And if you were present in previous years, I have tried to mix things up a little this year. There are some new things I've been playing with, and as luck would have it, they released a new version of WSJT, I think overnight. So I haven't even added it to the presentation. We're going to browse through some of the change logs and see what's going on. But let's take a look at things here. So this is HF digital modes, including FT8, and I've added Whisper this year because I want to talk a little more about Whisper. So first of all, for those of you who haven't been on one of these before, who am I? I was licensed in 2011. That's my original call sign there. I'm a senior computer systems engineer. I don't even know what my official title is anymore. Basically, I'm a computer engineer that works on all of the non-standard equipment, the stuff that the regular teams won't touch for Sloan Kettering Institute at Memorial Sloan Kettering. I've been a shortwave listener since I was a little kid, which is where the love of radios and electronics came from. I do a lot of kit building. I keep a list of available kits on the internet. It is a little out of date. I haven't updated it, I think, since June or so, but it needs to be updated. There's forever changing. Unfortunately, most of the changes lately have been things getting discounted. I live up in the Mid-Hudson Valley in New York State. I used to live on Long Island, which is how I got connected. Been offering random facts in my bios. I used to teach a class about wild edible plants. And there's my email address, easy to remember, neil@neilgoldstein.com. If you have questions after this, you can always email me directly. So what exactly is a digital mode? When we talk about digital modes for the purpose of this discussion, we're not talking about digital audio modes. We're talking about digital modes for sending text, data, sometimes pictures. These are ways of encoding those things, mostly text, but sometimes, as I said, data or pictures. And these modes are not encrypted as the rules of our hobby dictate. Most of these can be heard. It'll sound like tones or blips, musical notes, organized or disorganized noise. Technically, CW is a digital mode. That can be argued, but we're not going to talk about that here. So here's a list of some common ones. Of course, CW and RIDI I mentioned. All of the PSK formats. There's a bunch of related formats that look like a bunch of dots on the screen when you look at the waterfall. Olivia, Contested. Hellschreiber, which is a very old digital mode. It uses a way of transmitting very similar to radio facsimile, but in a much narrower band. Packet, MT63 are more data modes. These four here are, and Whisper are more where we concentrate the conversation here. We call the Joe Taylor modes, developed by Joe and his group. And yeah, we can send pictures, weather facts, and slow scan TV. A lot of people play with that in this hobby. Weather facts is interesting. If you've never played with it, look into it. But there years ago, they used to send a lot more than just weather over radio facts. There was even a color format where before the days of the internet, news services like UPI used to send their press. So there's lots of software, just a smattering of it here, but there are so many packages. The main one that we talk about here is WSJTX with FL-Digi as a close second for a lot of the things we discuss. JS8 Call is mentioned. It's a very specific piece of software for one mode, but you can look into all the rest of these. So I mentioned Joe Taylor. Joe is the head of the group that develops WSJTX. Stands for Joe Taylor, and Joe is an astrophysicist, won a Nobel Prize for his work with pulsars, but he is really into weak signal propagation, weak signal communications, things like moon bounce, meteor scatter. And he started taking some of these ideas and throwing them at computer engineer friends. And that's where we ended up with the software that we use for these really cool modes. At the 2021 awards luncheon, I got to meet Joe. He was the keynote speaker. Really, really stand-up guy. He's very accessible. He's a good speaker, and he's able to talk about his technology and hobby without really talking down to people at all. I really enjoyed sitting and listening to him talk, and I got to talk to him privately a little bit about what I do and this forum actually. So yeah, there it is, the Hudson Division 2021. Originally, he was just trying to leverage computer power to aid in encoding and decoding low power transmissions for things like EME. He spoke a little about where everything came from and the brilliant developers that joined on with him to get talking about the future of the modes and leveraging SDR technology a little more to make things work. And he says a lot of that may be able to get us out of the bandwidth restriction that we're currently on with some of the HF modes without interfering with other people. And it's interesting, the ideas that he's working on with this, and we'll see if the evolution of this software reflects his vision. So the software itself, WSJTX, can be used for weak signal communications, a bunch of things. And we use it for mostly FT8, FT4, and Whisper. To get this stuff working, to work fully functioning, there's two things you really need to have connected from your radio to your computer. One is for control, or what do we say, CAT control, usually done over a USB to serial connection. Some older rigs have just a serial port on them, or something that can be converted to or resembles a serial port once you use the proper cabling. And you want to get audio. Single direction just for something where you're just receiving, but two-way audio for most of these modes because you, like I said here, most older rigs require some sort of serial to USB conversion. A lot of the newer rigs, like the IC7300, most of the newer Yaesu rigs now, it's just USB. So the USB to serial conversion is being done inside of the radio. On a really old rig, you're going to be probably manual tuning. You're not going to be able to change frequencies automatically. Where you can still trigger push to talk with either the serial port connection or Vox. A lot of the software allows you to trigger transmitting with Vox, even to the point where there's a little pre-tone that'll come in just to get the transmit keyed up, and then you have to set. But you can use Vox to do this as well. For audio linking, if you're going to plug the audio ins and outs on your rig directly into your computer, you might get some noise that way or have a lot of trouble getting the levels correct. I really recommend audio interfaces like the Signal Link. I currently have one that I use with my Elecraft KX2 when I do digital modes outside of here. For the more modern rigs, once again, the IC7300, and I caught part of John's QRP talk the other day, and I thought it was funny that he said ham has one of these. It does seem that way sometimes. With a lot of the newer rigs, when you plug that USB cable in, you get not only the control, but you also get a sound card that's living inside of your radio. So you don't really need the Signal Link interfaces anymore, but they are really handy. There's also one you'll find on eBay called the EasyDigi, and there's a few others out there as well. So a lot of times getting this to work properly is a real headache for a lot of people. the best way I've found is just to use your search engine, Google or whatever you like, and just search for WS rig model name. And you should get plenty of results showing you screenshots or even YouTube videos with the configuration step by steps. As I said, YouTube tutorials. There's certainly enough information on there to get that done. Another little workaround, which I've fallen into that I don't mention here, is there's a couple pieces of software that allow you to have almost like a translator going in between your client software and your rig. One of them is FL Rig from the FL8 people. It just seems to be more forgiving. And if you can get FL Rig to work with your rig first, then you can match the settings that you got on it or use it as a go-between. A lot of this software, including WSJTX, lets you pick FL Rig as your rig, and then that software acts as a go-between. Another one, which has been around a lot longer, I think, and very popular, is OmniRig, and it's used in all sorts of situations to kind of shoehorn control where you normally wouldn't have it. So when we talk about FT8, we have to talk about JT65 first, because that's where this started. Joe's original idea for this mode was for EME or moon bounce and other really similar conditions where you were dealing with short-term connections, rapid changes, changes in propagation, in amplitude, in phase, and he was trying to find a mode that would hold the connection. So JT65 was what he came up with that. A lot of hams saw this mode as something they could use on the HF bands and started using it there. Once people started using it on HF features were added to the software to make it more usable on HF. So the signals are sent with forward error correction, which is a mathematical principle that I got a chance to learn a few years ago when I went back to college. It's really cool. It's a way of sending a little extra math along with your signal to ensure that, and the signals are capable of being decoded even below the noise floor. So that's how this mode works. Each signal used 65 tones, hence JT65, and just under 180 hertz in bandwidth. Each part of the exchange took 1 minute. So timing. All of these modes that we're going to talk about, the WSJT modes, require exact timing. And the reason is, if you're transmitting for a minute and then receiving for a minute and then transmitting for a minute again, everybody else who's transmitting and receiving within that same passband needs to be transmitting when you're receiving and receiving when you're transmitting. All of that has to be timed perfectly. So the clock on your computer has to be exact to everybody else's. And the best way to do that is to set it to world time, atomic time, WWV, whatever you would like to call it. But you need to have an exact time source. So Windows of the operating systems that we talk about with WSJTX is probably the worst as far as getting timing correct. As long as you're connected to the internet, Linux and Mac OS are much better at keeping things correct. So you should put software on, in the case of Windows, to make sure that your clock is correct. The software that I like to use is Meinberg NTP. There's instructions on WSJTX about where to get it and how to use it, but it's free. It works very well. For both Mac OS and Linux, you can change your settings either to synchronize with a different NTP server out on the internet, or to make sure that your update interval is quicker than maybe the default. But so far out of the box, I've found that my Mac and Linux systems are pretty accurate, and I haven't had to do too much. However, if you don't have a live internet connection, if you're operating remote or have a machine set up doing Whisper in a place where you really can't get it on the internet, you can use GPS. a method of talk about a rig that does that further on. So this was a typical JT65 exchange, calling CQ, somebody answering in the next segment, sending a signal report, receiving a signal report, and sending RRR or an acknowledgement, and then acknowledging again on the other end with 73. So this is 6 segments, each 1 minute long. This QSO is 6 minutes long. A lot of people used to joke that they would start a QSO in JT65 and go make a sandwich, and then for the next QSO they'd go make a cup of coffee, and for the next one, cut themselves a slice of pie. There were other issues with this mode as well, which we'll get into. So the A word, or automation. This comes up when people talk about FT8. A lot of people think that FT8 is a fully automatic mode, or any of these. There is a small amount of automation present. So if you set up WSJTX the way most people do, once you start that 6-part exchange, it does move from part to part automatically, as long as you set up that way. And people are like, well, what's the fun in that if the computer's doing all the work? Actually, the fun is trying to grab the signals and get the contacts you're trying to get. There might be a station, a far off land that you haven't gotten before, or a temporary station from a de-expedition. And that's where sometimes the challenge comes in, or especially during a contest where you might be trying to get a ton of digital contacts. So there is a certain amount of skill involved here. There is a way to put more automation into that, and that I disagree with, and I don't really talk about it. But there is a way to put more automation into FT8. That, I think, if you're not interacting at all and not using some of that skill to use the mode, that's what takes a lot of the fun out of it, I think. But as an IT guy, there might be 10 minutes of fun in just trying to make it work and see that it works, but that's about as far as I would get with it. So FT8 can be a hotly debated mode if you're on social media and any of the ham groups. I've found that most of the people that heavily criticize it or put up terrible jokes about it haven't used it themselves. Now that's a generalization. I do know some people that have tried it and thought it was interesting and didn't really enjoy operating, but that's fine. But I found most of the people that really speak ill of it haven't really used it. It can be a lot of fun. So power. This is one I was saying there was an issue with JC65. It was thought of as a low power mode, not designed for that, but not for the reasons a lot of people think. There are a lot of digital modes that people operate with very low power. Duty cycle was one of the issues with JT65. For a 60-second cycle, your transmitter was running for about 50 seconds straight, and then there's a pause for buffering and decoding on the other end. Running your transmitter flat out for 50 seconds at 100 watts is not necessarily very good for it, especially if you don't have a perfect tune. There's a lot that can go wrong there. So 50 seconds on, and then a little over a minute off, and then 50 seconds on again, not necessarily a great thing. FT8 fixes this. It knocks that 1 minute exchange down to 15 seconds. So 15 seconds times 6, you're looking at a minute and a half for a full QSO, but 15 seconds on and 15 seconds off, and it's actually about 11 or 12 seconds on because you have that same decode and buffering period in between. But because we've shortened that time, timing is even more important now. If you are not exact to the minute and half minute when you start transmitting, you're not going to get as many contacts. I know this for a fact because the radio, one of the radios we're going to look at in a few minutes here, when I first built it and powered it up for the first time at this desk, was using a new laptop that I bought recently to use with the radios. And when I first powered it up, I was receiving only a couple of stations here and there. And I turned on my 7300 over here, and I was getting tons of signals. You can hear what FT8 sounds like. And it's like, oh boy, I did something wrong. And then all of a sudden it occurred to me that I had never installed TimeSync software on the laptop. I installed Mindberg, rebooted just to be safe. And when I hooked it back up, I had so many signals coming in that they were, I had to use the CQ only feature just to see how many people were calling CQ. But yeah, make sure you get your timing up. So here's some facts on FT8. 8 tones, 47 hertz bandwidth, so we're getting even narrower. At the time that I did this presentation, it was a minus 20 dB decoding threshold. That may have improved. And it decodes all signals in the passband. What that means is that wherever you set your receive bar in the waterfall, you're still going to decode every signal that's on that FT8 band at that time, and much faster. You do have to be on your toes to try to snag the stations you want. So where do I get this software? Don't try to write this down because number one, it's a lot to write. Number two, it's wrong. Joe, in the last few weeks, has actually put up a new web page for WSJTX. Your best bet is to just Google WSJTX. And I recommend joining the Groups.io group for it. Just go into Groups.io and search for WSJTX, and you'll find the main forum. They announced the website change in there, and also announced the new releases in there. So you want to keep your installs up to date. Usually, if you skip a release or two, you're not going to have a big problem, but it still comes in both 32 and 64-bit versions for Windows, so I think you can still get it to run on XP. At some point that may change. Linux, there's builds for popular distributions, any of the Debian-based or RPM-based, which are Red Hat family distros. There's a Raspbian version for Raspberry Pi OS. There's also just source code, so you can build it for any Linux platform you want. I had to do that recently for Arch Linux, which I was running on one of the laptops, and built it from source. And if you've never done it before, you can find very, very detailed step-by-step instructions, which are good enough that you can pretty much copy and paste the code from the instructions. For Mac OS, I think it's still 10.13 and later, but you have to look at the README file. There are some things that you have to do with the environment variables first in a Mac to make sure that it runs, or else it will not run. This was recent changes for last year, and that major release was still the case up until very recently. After we finish the presentation, I'll take a look at the release notes with everybody. There were a couple of things that changed, but nothing too huge. They added a neat feature though, which I can't, I don't have it installed here yet, but I do like the idea. They've put in buttons for the more common modes, so you don't have to keep going up to the menu. So Whisper, I mentioned it earlier on when we were talking about the different modes. This is a WSJTX mode. It is not a QSO mode. It stands for Weak Signal Propagation Reporter or Reporting. These are 2-minute transmissions, and the format of these transmissions are such that they can be decoded. And there's not a lot of information being exchanged in 2 minutes. And what I mean by not a QSO mode is that if you're transmitting Whisper, someone is receiving you. You're not having a conversation with you. They're simply saying that it. And vice versa, if you just want to receive Whisper, you're just reporting up to the Whisper system who you're receiving and their data. We're also reporting where you are and what type of antenna you have. So there's a little piece of a map here. We'll get into this a little bit more. So there are other maps that you can use for looking at whisper spots. I prefer one called whisper.rocks, and the distances that you're going to have people hear you if you're transmitting whisper, I mean, much less than a watt, are quite incredible. And we'll take a look at what we're able to do with it. It's great for checking conditions, testing an antenna, looking at the bands dropping in, dropping out over a period of time. There are a number of newer QRP rigs, mostly kits projects, but a lot of them you can buy assembled, that support the mode natively, so you can transmit right out of the rig. Something I've been doing recently, if you haven't played with the MF or LF bands that the FCC gave us a few years back, you can listen in whisper on 630 and 2200 meters, or transmitting. We'll get into that, but a friend of mine was looking into this mode recently, and he was playing with whisper for the first time and really enjoying all the places hearing. And I told him to try 630 meters, and he see any signals coming in over the waterfall. I said, you don't have to see them. That's how well this mode works. The signals can be below that noise floor in your waterfall, and you won't notice them. Your eyes can't see them, but this software will sort them out. So give it a try. My IC 7300 here will tune all the way down to both of these bands. The antenna I put up most recently seems to be very quiet on the lower frequencies, which is amazing to me. I'm pretty close to power lines and everything, but I've been able to, the one night this past week that I had it running on 630, I picked up stations all over overnight on 630, as far as the Midwest. I've gotten further when I first tried this years ago, but it was just that one particular night. If you want to transmit on the MF or LF bands, you can modify an existing transceiver. Once again, I keep mentioning the 7300, but it's what I have. You can unlock the 7300 to transmit out of band. You would need an external low-pass filter on these bands, and you don't want to run full power. That could be damaging, but there's plenty of write-ups on how to get this to work. You can also buy a transverter. There's a couple of companies that make them, and you can also get, there's a couple of standalone radios that are made. Most of this stuff is kits, when you get into the transverters or the standalone radios. Here's a little bit of the hardware for these bands. And once again, these new bands, when we got them, they're not for voice. Most of what you're going to find on these bands are digital modes and some CW. So there's a website, 472kilohertz.org, that's going to give you guides to a lot of this gear, antennas, mods. You can just Google it, like a string like I have here, IC 7300, 630 meters. There's a transverter from minikits.com. That's one of the more common kits for 630. And softrockrx.com, which is the new supplier of Softrock kits. Took it over from Tony Parks. And the antennas, they're really, I've seen one antenna for sale on eBay for use on the low bands. It was rather pricey. Most of these are homebrew projects. Usually involves front loading an existing antenna or creating an interesting looking vertical. But there's plenty of projects on the internet for making the antennas. So this is from whisper.rocks. This is about a month of spots that I had. And this is using the new Zactec transceiver, which is a 200 milliwatt, actually it's not a transceiver, it's only a transmitter, but it's 200 milliwatts out. It is a little self-contained radio you can buy directly from Zactec. It is not a kit. But if you look at this map, Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania, Antarctica, South Africa, Alaska, And there's one which I keep calling it the North Pole, but yeah, there's a research station way up there in the ice. Receive running. I've run this on a little lithium-ion battery. The first time I tried it was one of these little tiny credit card size emergency cell phone batteries you can buy from Five Below. And it ran for about 6 hours on that thing. I have a larger pack I use for some of my QRP rigs. It'll run days on those. And if you're going to play with Whisper, make sure your time is synced. The Zactec transmitter and some of the other standalone projects that are out there either come with or offer a GPS option. The Zactec one comes with a GPS board internally. And this is the Zactec Whisper transmitter. Excuse my slide here. It's 200 milliwatts out, 80 through 10 meters. It is completely automatic, but also computer configurable, either through client software or through a web browser. It's a standalone once you configure it, though. You can unhook it from the computer and just power it up and it'll go. They're very resilient. He said you can pretty much transmit into a dead short full power and it's not going to do any damage. If you want to look, there's an article in September 2022 QST reviewing this thing. It's where I was first made aware of it was from the article, and it's zactec.com. He is currently only selling one version of it, but we may see maybe a high band version that'll go beyond 10 meters, and maybe that'll do these MF and LF bands that I've been talking about. So back to WSJTX. Very easy setup. I'm not going to get into every config screen, which I used to have on here. Most of this is self-explanatory, but once again, there are good guides for this on the internet. Just by searching for them, you'll find plenty. Plug in your specifics, call sign, grid square, and then there's options. Blank line between decoding periods, display distance in miles instead of kilometers. There's plenty of things here that are very self-explanatory. The radio screen, this is where most people have their headaches trying to get this to work with your serial connection. And once again, somebody has done this before you. Just make sure, do a little Googling and get all these numbers correct. One thing that can be very frustrating is sometimes trying the wrong numbers over and over again will lock up the serial stack on your computer, or even the adapter that you're using, whether it's internal in your rig or external. Sometimes rebooting between tries is a really good idea. It takes a lot more time, I know, but keep that in mind, is that you may have locked up your serial connection during your tries, and you may have already hit the one that should work, but it didn't because you were locked up. This is the sound card settings. And once again, usually pretty straightforward. Most rigs will have information here in the description when you hit this drop down, so it's pretty obvious which one is the rig and which one is the sound card in your machine. But if you're not sure, Google is your friend. This is the main window in WSJTX. As I said before, we were setting modes by hitting the drop-down menu and choosing a mode here. We're currently set up in FT8. It's receiving. You can see received stations and the people on the selected frequency that you are on in the waterfall. So when you're having an exchange with somebody, show up here. Periodically, other signals will show up here because somebody happens to be on the same frequency you were selected from your last QSO. Little audio signal incoming. You want to keep it usually in this mid-high range. This will turn red when you're clipping. If you have too much audio coming in, you have to adjust your levels. Too low, you won't get enough decodes. If it's too high, you're getting distortion and you're not decoding. The new version I just mentioned, I saw a picture of it, has a row of buttons right here, that are for the more common modes. And this is just describing a lot of what I just mentioned again. This is what do you call it, the wide graph or the waterfall display, and this shows you the signals in the passband. This picture only goes up to about 1200 here. You have about 2500 hertz or 2.5 kilohertz of bandwidth, usually with WSJTX, and there'll be signals across most of it. If you're going to call CQ, that's the best thing to use the graph for, to try to find an empty spot to set your transmit in. People tend to get upset if you transmit on top of them when they're already having a QSO or trying to operate a contest station. You never know who you're interfering with, but yeah, sometimes the bands are just too busy and you want to wait a little bit, but this gives you an idea. Clicking changes your receive frequency. Control click will also change your transmit frequency. There is something called split mode. This has to do with keeping your transmit audio in the 1500 to 200 hertz range. So it'll shift frequency on your rig so that you're always within that range. You're not always just transmitting at the base frequency like 14074 for 20 meters. You'll see your transmit frequency change on your rig. Some rigs through cat control are capable of doing this with the dual VF. Fake it will just change your transmit frequency periodically to keep you within that narrow. And if you don't want to do that or don't have the ability to, you just check none. This is a piece of add-on software that a lot of people like, JT Alert from hamapps.com. This allows you to set alerts for various stations, countries, US states, different things that you're looking for, and it will alert you with color codes, with tones. It also allows you to do some direct logging to some of the logging services, which is nice. This is, if you're a Mac person, JT Bridge for Mac OS, very similar to JT. Briefly, FT4 was developed for contesting, really. You'll see people using it regularly, but it's not as efficient. It's a 4-tone mode, spaced 20 hertz apart, 7.5 second transmissions, even more dependent on time synchronization, but it's twice as fast as FT8. The reason why it's more of a contesting mode is you're getting the number of transmissions or QSOs in a very short amount of time. JS8 call is a modification of the FT8 protocol for QSOs. You can actually chat through JS8. Newest versions have different speeds depending on conditions, slow, normal, fast, or turbo, giving you 30, 15, 10, and 6-second communication frames. There are different types of messages you can do in JS8 call. Similar to PSK31, you can have a keyboard-to-keyboard chat, or undirected for calling CQ out into the JS8 call passband, or directed. You can, if you see somebody you recognize or want to hit directly, you can go to them directly or do all call to get everybody in the passband. And there's an idea of what it looks like. It's a modification of the WSJTX software, taking the open source part of that and to work for this. There are kits. As I mentioned, I am a big kit builder. I run for the Long Island CW group. I run the Wednesday night makers forum. There are currently 3 available that are worth talking about. The 13 transistor transceiver from Adam Rong at CR Kits, the AFP FSK from QRP Guys, uses the newer version now uses a DDS for changing bands, not plug-in modules, and the QDX digital transceiver from QRP Labs, which is still evolving. Hans, a couple of weeks ago, released the new high band model, which does 20 through 10 meters. The original one does 80 through 20. You can do a portable setup with a small, let's say, Raspberry Pi and an LCD screen, or a very small laptop, and have a completely portable digital mode setup using, let's say, the QTX like I'm using here. There's my setup. So little 7-inch Raspberry Pi terminal with a Bluetooth keyboard, and I'm running the Ham Pi distro, by the way, on that Raspberry Pi, which we talk about in my next forum. This is the 13 transistor digital receiver from Adam Wrong at CR Kits. This is the transceiver from QRP guys. My mistake, it still uses the modules. It needs them for transmitting, but tuning is digital now. And then this is the QRP Labs QDX from Hans Summers. This is an SDR-based radio internally. It is a kit, but you can order them assembled. I've built 2 of them now, and I have a 3rd one to build because I just got my high band one. Information on the QDX, the original one, 80 through 20, and now the high band version. It works for most single tone modes, FT8, JS8 call, whisper. It'll work for RTTY. It does 5 watts at 9 volts. You can build it to run on 12 volts, but they recommend 9. Full USB control from WSJTX or other CAT compatible software. It emulates a Kenwood rig for CAT control. There's a new terminal-based setup, an easy firmware update system that Hans has developed. It's really slick, and you can buy it with a nice professional metal case. So most of all, have fun. Ignore the trolls. In the case of FT8, a lot of people like to, badmouth the mode, but it can be a lot of fun if you've never tried it. Any questions? There's my email address again, neil@neilgoldstein.com. I will post a link to this presentation. I will send that in. Hopefully all that'll be up tomorrow, or I know HRU, I believe, will have this on YouTube, this whole discussion, the video and everything. But if you blog, fofio.blogspot.com, I will have a couple of posts up by tomorrow night with pertinent links and contact information and a link to this presentation there. So you can contact me through there. I'm going to end this slideshow, but keep the screen shared. All right. So we should still be. I have a couple of things I can demonstrate real quick. The QDX is sitting here running on the Raspberry Pi. Let me just quit out of ham clock here. Okay. Gary, is this coming across? Oh, I will assume everybody can see this.
Perfectly, Neil.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I have WSJTX running here on the Raspberry Pi. Once again, not the newest version, just came out, but this is running on the Hans Summers QDX that I just built last week. It's a version 3, and you can see how much it's receiving here. Now, on a busy band like this, and I can show you what the waterfall looks like. There's our waterfall at the moment. On a busy band, you can check the little CQ only box here. As we get through these 15-second cycles, you'll see that only the red will come up, which are CQ at the moment. You can mess with these color codes, have it alert you even without a piece of software like JT Alert that certain stations, certain locations are talking to you. Let's see if we get a few more on this cycle. Just one there. It's a little quieter than when I first set it up, but if I want to have a QSO with one of these people, I would just double click them in this left screen. Transmitting. For about 12 seconds. Drop transmit. It's going to receive. See if we get a reply. That's somebody in my own grid square. I did that on purpose. Let's see. Yep. So he heard us. Gave me a -24. So I'm kind of skipping mostly over him at the moment. We're saying that we're receiving him at -18. The fact that this worked first try, folks, by the way, was not planned. So feel lucky that we were able to have a live QSO here. And I know we only have a few minutes left, but I do want to show Whisper. So I'm going to let this complete. And I have Whisper running. So this is the web interface for the Zactec Whisper transmitter. And you can see I'm transmitting on 20 meters here. And it shows my output frequency. It shows that GPS is currently locked, and you get a pattern of the receiver and what it's linked to. I am currently set up as a Whisper beacon, but you can also use this as a signal generator. This one, you can see all the colors here. These are the bands that I am able to transmit on. And if you check all of these, it will cycle through them automatically, one after the other. So, and once again, this is the web-based config. Chrome, I found out when I bought this radio, has serial capability. You can actually connect to a serial port through the browser. So, but they also make a piece of Windows software for doing this configuration. But once you disconnect, the radio will power up and automatically go into whatever you select here. Let's just look at the map. I'm going to resync. So this is the last 4 hours looking for my call of transmissions, unique calls, so we won't get duplicates. Got the max way up, but we're not going to be anywhere near 5,000. But let's search, and there we go. So this is since I started this transmitter, which was about an hour before this forum. This is who's hearing me. So we've got Alberta up here, Denmark, Canary Islands. We're doing well. If I had, this is running on an Alex loop indoor antenna right now, oriented about like you see here, roughly. So when I put it on the big antenna, that's when I get things like Antarctica and the North Pole. So really a lot of fun. I do want to really quick, because we only have a couple of minutes. This is the release notes for version 2.6. Mode selection buttons on the main window. Support for the ARRL International DX contents. Performance improvements in FT8 and Q65. New features for EME Echo. New convenience features for Fox and Hound operators. Display features for the contest log. And then there's a lot of other bug fixes if you scroll through the release candidates that came out prior to this official release. And then if you keep going here, eventually you'll end up back at 2.5.4, which is what we were looking at in last year's forum. So one of the things I mentioned last year was dark mode, which you can do with a string when you launch the program. But there is a dark mode now if you like your apps to not be so bright. Gary, I don't know if we're ending right on time or not, since I'm doing the next forum as well, but that's up to you.
Completely up to you. If you want to take a few minutes, I just wanted to have a quick conversation with you between.
Sure. But I don't know if we can, if there's Any pressing questions? I think I want to turn off the presentation real quick though. Well, I don't know how far I can stretch the wires here, but.
Well, we do have a question in chat.
Sure.
Steve N2PQJ would like you to comment on good operating practices when transmitting split on FT8.
Ooh. Well, that's a good point. So, because technically it could put you on top of somebody else's signal. I think you really want to see what's going on in that waterfall, where you're ending up. But that's a good question, Steve. And actually, to tell you the truth, you caught me off guard on that one. It's something I really probably should research and look into. If you can see my picture here, I'm holding the QDX up. It was pulsing, that LED, when I first held it up, which was probably finishing that QSO that we created before. So, what else? I wanted to, any other pressing questions you can throw at me while I'm poking around here, but this is a SoftRock RXTX that is built for 630 meters. This is probably one of the last radios that Tony Parks built. He would not sell this as a kit. He did LF and MF radios only as already assembled. He felt it was just a very difficult job to get them to work correctly. So
Another viewer would like you to comment on the usability of amps with FT8.
On which with FT8?
Using amps, amplifiers.
Oh, well, it can also be a controversial subject, but FT8 is not a low power mode. It has evolved to not be that way. A lot of people feel that you shouldn't be using, more than 20 watts. Some people tell you don't use more than 50 watts. But I know people that throw as much power as they have into it. One of the problems is overloading your signal into that waterfall. If you're doing overkill when propagation is really good, sometimes you'll see some of these signals really, bleeding over. So you don't want to overmodulate. If you want to play with using a lot of power, just make sure that your audio level for transmit is not out of whack, or you're going to have some people upset. Case, but I'm not going to say don't use 200 or 300 or 500 watts into this. Personally, I wouldn't. I've used 50, but I usually dial back to 20 or so when I'm on the 7300. I have bumped it up to 100 when I was trying to get a really, really, crazy station that I needed for something, but there's nothing that says no.
Okay, Neil, we'll end the session now. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks everybody for attending.